It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I did start working with the Prime Minister in June 2011, which was exactly when we started our program. Our memorandum was signed in a few months before, and then when the new government took office was exactly when we started to implement our adjustment program, which will be scheduled to end in June, at the end of June 2014. So I have indeed been in Portugal for what were the most difficult years of the crisis, still not resolved or overcome, at least not completely, in Portugal and in Europe. And it's a great opportunity here to reflect a little bit on what has happened in Portugal and Europe in the past 2 years and a half. I want to speak about a number of different things, about Europe, about Portugal, some questions of having to do with the architecture of the Eurozone, but also some more practical, more political questions. So I'll try to somehow include everything. And in order to help us organize our thoughts, I want to focus on two main points. I'm going to call them the fiscal question and the economic question, and you'll see that the way I see this, that they are two different questions, and the problem many times is that they are confused. So let me start with the fiscal question and tell you both what I think about the issue and how the government in Portugal has been addressing our fiscal problems. So first of all, I should say that in my opinion, there is always a fiscal question or a fiscal problem. There is always a problem of fiscal discipline and the necessity to have fiscal discipline. You probably know that sometimes we hear arguments that this is not necessarily the case. That perhaps a country that has its own currency doesn't really have a fiscal problem because it can always print more money. So it doesn't have a problem of public debt by definition. And the problem only appears in the Eurozone because member states don't have control over their own currency. You also hear the argument that some countries don't seem to suffer from a fiscal problem at all. Let's say Japan, with extremely high levels of public debt and seems to be stable and fiscally stable. So either one argument or the other is used quite often to try to suggest that the fiscal question is not there, or it's less important than people think it is, and that perhaps the Europeans are obsessed about the fiscal problem and they shouldn't be. Look around the world, look at the United States, look at Japan, and you'll see that perhaps it's not that big a question. I want to disagree with this. For me, there is always a fiscal question. It's true that if a country can print its own currency, it doesn't face the threat of default in the traditional sense, but it faces the threat of inflation, which is a kind of default, not in a technical sense, but in an economic sense. It's a form of default. You get paid in currency that it's not worth the same that it was worth when you lended the money. So the question is there even if a country has its own currency. The question is there even if, like in the case of Japan, the levels of debt are very high. Why is the question always there? First, because levels of debt depend very much on the conditions in each particular country. Whether public debt is held domestically or is held by international investors. In Japan, it's predominantly domestic, so that changes things a little bit. It also changes things if a country has control over its own currency, of course. I do think that in Europe, levels of public debt in Eurozone have to be lower because countries are under the Euro discipline. And most important of all, the fiscal question is a dynamic question. It doesn't have to do so much with static levels of debt, it has to do with debt dynamics. Is public debt under control or is it not under control? And in Japan, levels of debt may be very high, but the question that investors want to see answer is what are the debt dynamics? Is debt under control or is it growing, is it exploding? And it can never be out of control. Debt dynamics have to be managed. So in that sense, there is always a fiscal question. And perhaps the level of debt to GDP could be 200%, 250%. That under some specific conditions may be acceptable. What is not acceptable is for it to be growing without limit and in fact to be exploding or out of control. That will not be accepted by investors anywhere. So in this sense, it seems to me that there is always a fiscal question. It is not an ideological question. That is my other point that I want to make. It seems to me that the idea of fiscal discipline is not an idea that belongs to the right or to the left. To the right, perhaps more plausible. In contemporary debate, it seems sometimes that on the right, people are more interested in fiscal discipline than on the left. If we look at history, many times it has been the opposite. The left has been more concerned with fiscal discipline than the right. To me, it's not an ideological question. It doesn't divide the left and the right. Let me try to say a little bit about this. It seems to me that precisely a party on the left should be even more interested in fiscal discipline than a party on the right. Why? Because if you believe in the idea of a welfare state as an insurance mechanism, people need an insurance mechanism. They need to have something to rely in case of illness, unemployment, old age, perhaps death of a close relative. In contemporary society, you need a form of public insurance to face the most serious risks of, in fact, of contemporary life. And so for many people, contemporary society is a risk society and risk has to be managed. That's the main role of the welfare state. And I do agree with this, but then it seems to me that if you want the welfare state to be an insurance mechanism that everyone can rely on, and that it's always there, doesn't depend on the fluctuations of fate, then debt has to be under control, and probably levels of debt have to be lower than they are in Western Europe right now, and the deficit has to be well managed. Why? Because if levels of debt are very high, and if the deficit is not well managed, then the welfare state will be vulnerable to fluctuations of confidence in financial markets. So its essential function of being an insurance mechanism will disappear. It can only be an entirely solid insurance mechanism if the fiscal question is well managed and well addressed. So if people on the left, parties on the left, are especially concerned about having a strong, solid welfare state, then they have to be concerned with fiscal discipline. This is my opinion, and I keep saying this in Portugal. Fiscal discipline, limits on that and on the budget should be a question of widespread agreement and consensus. Should be agreed by parties from the right to even the far left. I know it's not the case, and it's not the case in Portugal, but it should be the case in my opinion. So this is what it seems to me to be the basic ideas when we think about the fiscal question. Before I turn to the economic question and before I try to explain why I think they are different in Europe, let me just say a little bit about the very important question of whether fiscal problems should be addressed mainly at the national level or at the European level. And here I have to say that I'm more inclined towards thinking that they should be addressed at the national level, predominantly at the national level. You probably have heard that Schumpeter called the budget the soul of a country, and I remember reading this a few years ago and not quite understanding what he meant. And Schumpeter is famous for strange sentences that seem very strange, very awkward, very idiosyncratic. But now, actually, after working in politics for 2.5 years, and I'm sure people here who have worked in politics in Greece will agree with me, I'm starting to understand that this is, in fact, a very, very accurate sentence. A national budget is a better description of a country than a travel guide or any other source of information you could get. In a budget, there's all sorts of compromises between powerful and less powerful groups. There's all sorts of choices that are specifically national. If you go through the budget, you see how a country works in practice. And it's very difficult to see how these national characteristics could disappear very quickly, and that we could have a European budget that would somehow be able to make all these small, difficult, delicate compromises that a national budget always tries to do. So the fiscal question in Portugal has been delicate for the past 2.5 years, as it has been in Greece. Every budget discussion is a long, very hard discussion where everyone is involved. That's a good thing. That's a good thing, and I think it's one sort of wish is that it had been like this before the crisis. Every budget choice had been scrutinized so carefully as it is now, then we wouldn't have gotten into so much trouble. So I don't think it is a problem that budget processes are long, difficult. This is what, in fact, the core of democracy is about, the budget process. There was an awareness of this, and in fact, in most of our countries in Europe, the budget process has a certain solemnity. It's supposed to be long. It's supposed to go on for a month in Parliament, because people had an awareness that the crucial questions are being addressed here, and they should be discussed, and they should be difficult. This is what politics is about. They should be about compromise, sometimes very difficult compromises. And we can talk more about the Portuguese case during the question period. I'd be glad to discuss that. But as a general idea, it seems to me that these questions are more naturally addressed at the national level, and that we should be careful about moving them to the European level, either through a European budget or through a mechanism of budget discipline that leaves no room for national compromises, and that in the end attempts to make the decisive budget choices in Brussels rather than in the national capitals. I find this a dangerous path to take. In Portugal and Greece, the very difficult budgets we approved in the last few years, imagine if they had been approved officially and formally in Brussels by a budget commissioner. What reaction would we have had in the streets in Lisbon, Portugal, and other countries? I think that I'll speak more comfortably about Portugal, but one thing in Portugal that has made the debate much more stable and much more productive is the idea that people chose this government, that these questions were discussed during the campaign, and that they will have a choice 2 years from now again, a little less than 2 years. And so the fact that democratic legitimacy is there, and it's so direct at the national level, is very important to make budget discussions what they should be, and to guarantee that they have a democratic core, without which it would be very difficult to see them working. Let me move now to the economic question. Start by explaining the difference, and you can probably guess that when we move towards the economic question, I'll in fact argue that in this case it is essentially a European question and not a national question. But maybe I should start by saying that I think there are two different questions, and the problem has been during the crisis that they haven't been adequately separated, and it's not sufficient to separate them conceptually. They have to be separated and distinguished by political institutions, by financial regulation, by economic policy. And this will take us, in fact, to the question of the banking union. Because what has been the problem? The problem has been that fiscal questions in Europe, fiscal problems, states that are under fiscal stress, those stresses, those problems have been transmitted to the whole economy. And you've heard this question about the feedback loops between sovereign risk and bank risk, and the idea which started to be defended in April 2012 that our main goal should be to break the link between sovereign risk and bank risk. If a country is under fiscal stress, those difficulties will be transmitted to the banking sector, and then from the banking sector to the rest of the economy, to companies, to families. and so on. And European leaders have made the decision, and I think this should in fact be praised. For someone like me who thinks that this is the fundamental problem, it's actually quite remarkable that leaders at the European Council relatively quickly identified it and start thinking about the ways to solve it. And I do think, personally, even looking at it as an academic, that it is the fundamental problem. It doesn't make any sense, to put it very clearly and very bluntly. It doesn't make any sense for a company in Portugal, which is already under a severe disadvantage because taxes are going up in order to face the fiscal difficulties that the Portuguese state has. So the economy is already suffering from austerity measures, so consumers are buying less, and the company is already suffering from this. So the company is suffering from the problems that the state has to deal with, and that's perhaps unavoidable. But what is avoidable, and what in fact is goes beyond what one should accept, is that the company is also suffering in a second sense because it has to pay much higher interest rates when it finances itself, and not because of its own characteristics, its own market difficulties, its known product, not because it's launching a new product and it hasn't gone well, but simply because the sovereign has to pay a higher interest rate, and the higher interest rate is transmitted mechanically to companies. It's transmitted first to banks because, and you know these mechanisms, banks, their rating suffers if the sovereign rating suffers. If they have holdings of public debt, their balance sheets will suffer if the sovereign is under stress. If the sovereign has to help or support the banking sector, then it also suffers from increased fiscal difficulties, which then transfer back to the banks, and you create a feedback loop that keeps feeding on itself. So these mechanisms have been well identified by European institutions and by the European Central Bank, by the Commission, and the goal now is very clearly to break these links. In my view, what we should aim for is a situation where in Europe, sovereigns, national states may get into trouble at one time or another, and in the future it may be different countries. You know, there have been fiscal crises in almost every country in Europe over the last few decades. It's not the South that has a fiscal crisis, and the North, countries in the North have had fiscal crises in the past, and very severe ones. So different countries will go through different fiscal problems if they can't manage their own debts and their own deficits. But we should aim for a situation where, on the side, there is a single market that works as independently as possible, as autonomously as possible from national states, so that a company in Portugal or in Greece or in Italy or in Germany will not mechanically and immediately suffer from difficulties that originate in the sovereign and that originate in the national budget. If we can break the links, and it's possible to break the links between the sovereign and banks, because this is where the problem is, then banks on the one hand and companies will be able to operate within a single market that is preserved from problems that appear in different countries. If European banks were truly European banks, then they would not suffer because one national state is in trouble, in fiscal trouble, right? A bank operating all over Europe would not suffer because one state is under stress. If banks are national, if banks are Greek, if banks are Portuguese, and if the Greek state or the Portuguese state gets in trouble, banks are immediately, automatically, even if they have made no mistakes in the past. And we have examples of this. There have been banks in Southern Europe that have managed their business remarkably well, and they were paying higher interest rates than banks in Germany that managed their business extremely badly. This is a decisive question because, first of all, it is not raises questions of justice, and impartiality, but also raises questions of economic rationality and efficiency. It doesn't make any sense from any perspective you look at it, either political or economic. And I think every member state in Europe understands this. This is why I'm fundamentally optimistic about the crisis, because I see that every member state in Europe understands that this does not make any sense, and that we have, through the idea of a banking union, tried to break these links and try to free financial markets and other markets from the tutelage, the influence, the overbearing influence of the sovereigns. In fact, a single, common market can only exist if this very close linkage between national banks and national states is broken. Have we been doing enough in this respect? I think you can look at this from both perspectives. On the one hand, you have to be happy, and that you have to be happy and to sort of and be confident in the end that the question has been addressed already in April 2012, and that the idea of the banking union has been moving forward. It's been moving forward relatively quickly. So we have already decisions made on common supervision. The ECB will be responsible for supervising European banks, and those decisions have been finalized, and will start less than a year from now. We're moving forward on the question of bank resolution. If there's a crisis and a bank has to be wound down or has to be closed, there's already rules about how this should be done, same rules for every European country. And we're trying to work on a resolution fund that can help banks that are, in the end, sustainable, go through a period of difficulty and still survive. Although, as you know, investors should also be responsible for the investments they made, and it shouldn't be just taxpayers that would be responsible for resolving banking crises. So I think in a fundamental sense, progress has been made. There's been a lot of clarity about what the problem is, and progress has been made. You could perhaps wish that it would be quicker, because it is, we are in a state of deep financial fragmentation. That has not been solved in Europe. It is a critical situation, and so in a critical situation, you could wish that things had been a little quicker. And in particular, the question of bank resolution has been dragging on for a few months already. It was supposed to be solved by the end of this year, and it's not clear that it will be completely solved by the end of this year. So I think there's room here for different interpretations. On the one hand, I don't think you can say that no progress has been made, but I think it's also fair to say that progress could have been and should have been a bit quicker. But in the end, what is the way to think about the question? Because I think the main difficulty with the euro crisis has been it's a very complex question which touches on almost everything, many different elements, and the way to bring them together, even conceptually, is the main challenge. And this is what I've actually been working on, even when for the few months where I was back in university and trying to write something on the euro crisis. So to try to conclude, how do I think about it? Two different questions, a fiscal question and the economic question. The problem is that they're mixed together, so that an economy ends up suffering because there are fiscal difficulties. We have to be much better at separating the two questions. On the one hand, we have banks, families, companies. They should be able to operate in a sphere that is as autonomous as possible from the sovereign. So the economic question, how the economy works, is separate from the fiscal question, how national budgets work. It's separate, and it should be made separate, more than it is in Europe now. And then how to address the two questions. It seems to me, for the reasons that I tried briefly to explain, that the fiscal question is better addressed at the national level. And it seems to me that the economic question is better addressed at the European level. Let me just say a few more things about this last point, because it seems to me the only one that I haven't sufficiently addressed. I don't think that the economic question, how to get back on a growth path, how to start fighting unemployment more effectively than we have done so far, it doesn't seem to me that this question can be addressed at the national level. We need European institutions, we need a banking union, we need a fully functional banking union for the economy to start recovering. This is the first point. Second, I think we also need economic policy that is better coordinated. For example, different initiatives to facilitate credit for small and medium-sized enterprises. I'm a bit frustrated that these initiatives have been taken by different member states in different ways, pulling in different directions, sometimes in opposite directions. Some member states have been trying to reignite their venture capital markets. Other member states have been trying to go down the path of securitization for bank loans. Other member states have been trying to create a corporate bond market so that companies are less dependent on bank credit. But every state has been doing its own thing. To me, this seems very strange, because this is the crucial question, how to, economic policy having to do with financial markets and how to regulate financial markets. And it's a question that should be addressed at the European level, or should be addressed in terms of the banking union directly at the European level, and should be addressed in terms of economic policy with better coordination between member states, that they should be trying to develop the common initiative to ease credit to SMEs. And there are ideas about this initiative, they're being discussed, there are papers written on common initiatives, but it's very difficult to get member states to agree and work together. Why? Because when it comes to financial markets, they still think in national terms. There's this very close linkage between banks and states, and to break this is extremely difficult. It goes back to the 14th century in Florence with the Medici. It's a constant of European political life that banks and states live together. So it's very difficult and a big challenge to break this connection, but crucial to break it. And finally, I don't think that you have growth and the kind of growth that we want in Europe without further economic integration. So also in this case, it's a European and not a national question. You cannot have investment coming back at the levels that we want without a common energy market, without a common digital market. Why would a company make very, very significant investments in energy or digital if he has to work with 28 legal frameworks, if it cannot capture synergies across borders? You know, companies are making huge investments in energy and digital in China and in the US because they have a single legal framework. They have 400 million consumers, or in the case of China, more than 1 billion. And they have an integrated market both in the United States and in China, which makes it very appealing for investment. In Europe, they have these fragmented energy markets, fragmented digital markets, fragmented transport markets. So the most fundamental sectors of the economy, digital, energy, and transport, not to mention financial markets, are fragmented along national lines. So I'm quite skeptical that we can have a vibrant European economy until these fundamental markets, financial markets, energy, transport, and digital have been fully integrated, and starting with financial markets and with the banking union. So to try to summarize everything in 2 or 3 sentences. 2 different questions, the fiscal question and the economic question. They're separate conceptually. They're not always separate in practice, but they have to be made separate. We have to create the institutions that allow us to deal with fiscal and economic problems separately and not get them all mixed together. And finally, fiscal question better addressed at the national level, and economic question better addressed at the European level. So it's sort of a rule of thumb for me that when we're talking about growth and jobs, this is mostly a European question. When we're talking about fiscal problems, this is mostly a national question. But you know, if we don't break the connection between the two questions, it's going to be very difficult. Because even if a country is being successful in addressing its fiscal problems, it's a very long process. I think we've all now become aware of this, and maybe this was a mistake that, that the Troika made. The idea that you can address significant fiscal problems in 2 or 3 years and solve them completely, perhaps this is true of emerging markets. But of a developed Western economy, it's certainly not true. Discretionary expenditure is much lower percentage of the budget in a developed Western economy than it is in an emerging market or a developing country. So the traction, the influence that you have over the kind of adjustments you need to do is small. You can put the country on a trajectory of fiscal consolidation, but you put it on a trajectory, you cannot do it in 2 or 3 years. Now, if the economic recovery is dependent on the fiscal consolidation process, then it's all going to take as much time as the fiscal consolidation process will take. You see, this for me is the crucial problem. If you make it dependent on fiscal consolidation, it's going to be a long, difficult process. But it doesn't make any sense for economic recovery to be a long, difficult process. As you know from the remarks I made at the beginning, I don't think we can make fiscal consolidation a quick process. The fiscal question is difficult, it's always there. So let it be difficult and long, and states have to work on it for years to come. But on the other hand, don't make the whole economy hostage to the fiscal consolidation process. It's not even from perspective of almost political philosophy, it's not even compatible with any idea of justice we have. Why should a family or a company be made hostage to a long, protracted, difficult process of fiscal consolidation? Why should they put their plans on hold for 10, 15 years while a national state puts its house in order? Okay, I think this is a good way to finish my initial comments. And maybe I could have spoken a little more about Portugal. I haven't mentioned the name Portugal, but this comes from the experience in Portugal. And I think you could see that it comes directly from the experience in Portugal. And if you want to discuss Portugal a bit more now in the question period, I'll be glad to do that.